18 former staff members. That is the number reportedly connected to what insiders have grimly nicknamed the Sussex Survivors Club. And folks, what they are finally revealing about their time working for Meghan Markle is nothing short of explosive. For years, the palace maintained its stoic silence, the carefully guarded, never complain, never explain tradition, acting as an impenetrable shield around allegations that would have destroyed anyone else's reputation. But that shield is cracked wide open, and the testimonies pouring out are painting a portrait so starkly different from the humanitarian mental health advocate image Meghan has cultivated that even her most devoted supporters are struggling to reconcile the two. Let us be brutally honest here. This is not a case of one disgruntled employee nursing a grudge. This is not workplace gossip blown out of proportion. We are talking about a documented pattern spanning 2 continents, multiple organizations, and nearly a decade of professional relationships that ended in chaos. The infamous email where a staff member allegedly wrote that Meghan made them cry was treated as an isolated incident at the time. Palace officials dismissed it, Meghan's supporters claimed it was fabricated, and the media cycle moved on. But according to sources now breaking their silence, that email was merely the tip of an iceberg, so massive it would make the Titanic look lucky. The timing of these revelations is no accident. With Meghan's business ventures struggling, her Hollywood dreams stalling, and her foundation Archewell hemorrhaging staff at an unprecedented rate, former employees who once feared speaking out are finding strength in numbers. One source put it bluntly to reporters, "We stayed quiet because we thought we were the only ones. Now we know there are enough of us to fill a room, and that changes everything." And they are absolutely right. There is power in collective testimony, and what is emerging suggests a workplace culture that allegedly left multiple people seeking therapy, questioning their professional worth, and in some cases choosing unemployment over continued service. The question that keeps surfacing is devastatingly simple. How does someone who built an entire public persona around kindness, empowerment, and mental health awareness allegedly treat the people closest to her professional life in ways that reportedly left them traumatized? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Here is a woman who gave a globally watched interview about her own mental health struggles, who launched initiatives focused on workplace wellness, who has positioned herself as a champion for those without voices. Yet the voices of her own former employees tell a dramatically different story. Let that sink in for a moment. But the email was nothing compared to what staff allegedly endured behind closed doors, and the early warning signs were reportedly there from the very beginning. The public first fell in love with Meghan Markle during her courtship with Prince Harry. She was the American actress who seemed refreshingly modern, relatable, and warmly enthusiastic about joining the world's most famous family. The palace publicity machine worked overtime to present her as the perfect addition to the firm, a breath of fresh air, who would help modernize an institution often criticized as stuffy and out of touch. But behind the carefully choreographed photo opportunities and the glowing press coverage, sources claim an entirely different reality was unfolding within Kensington Palace. Staff members who had served the royal family for decades, who had navigated the demanding personalities of princes and princesses with professional grace, reportedly found themselves blindsided by what they encountered. According to insiders, long-serving palace veterans tried to mentor Meghan on the intricate protocols of royal life, explaining the traditions, the expectations, and the carefully calibrated ways things had always been done. Their guidance was allegedly met with dismissal at best, and humiliation at worst. One source described the atmosphere as walking on eggshells from day one. Allow me to translate. These were seasoned professionals who had handled sensitive royal matters for years, suddenly finding themselves uncertain how to approach their own workplace. The contrast between Meghan's public persona and the whispered complaints circulating through palace corridors created a peculiar tension. Here was a woman championing kindness and empowerment on the global stage, while according to multiple sources, staff members dreaded interactions with her behind closed doors. The palace, bound by its sacrosanct tradition of never complaining and never explaining, chose silence. This silence, which was intended to protect the institution, may have inadvertently allowed a pattern to continue unchecked. No public accountability meant no public pressure to change. Reports of the Sussex Survivors Club began circulating among royal correspondents years ago, though few dared publish the details at the time. The name itself speaks volumes about how former employees allegedly viewed their experience. Survivors, not former colleagues, not alumni. Survivors. That is not language people use to describe a challenging but fair boss. That is language reserved for experiences that left lasting marks. Sources claim this informal network of former employees found each other through mutual connections, sharing stories that were startlingly similar despite the individuals never having worked together directly. The palace's protective silence created an information vacuum that Meghan's team filled with their own narrative. Any complaints were dismissed as racism, jealousy, or resistance to change. Staff members who raised concerns were allegedly painted as hidebound traditionalists, unable to accept a modern woman of color in their ranks. And here is the devastating irony. By refusing to engage with the allegations publicly, the palace allowed this counter-narrative to flourish unchallenged. The staff members who allegedly suffered in silence watched as their experiences were reframed as evidence of institutional bigotry rather than legitimate workplace concerns. And what these survivors allegedly experienced would shock even the most cynical royal watchers, starting with patterns that emerged before Meghan even walked down the aisle. The warning signs reportedly began almost immediately after the engagement announcement in November 2017. According to sources familiar with the Sussex household operations, staff members found themselves receiving emails at 5 in the morning, with expectations of immediate responses. For context, British working culture, particularly within the royal household, operates on fairly traditional hours. The palace is not a Silicon Valley startup where round-the-clock availability is normalized. Yet sources claim Meghan allegedly brought an intensity of expectation that caught even the most dedicated employees off guard. One particularly damaging allegation involves how Meghan allegedly handled disagreements in front of other staff members. According to insiders, employees reported being dressed down in the presence of colleagues, an experience described as deeply humiliating by those who endured it. Now, every boss has moments of frustration, every workplace has tensions, but there is a fundamental difference between delivering criticism privately and professionally versus allegedly making spectacles of perceived failures. One former staff member reportedly described feeling small, worthless, and questioning years of successful experience after such encounters. Let that sink in. Career professionals with impeccable credentials allegedly reduced to self-doubt by interactions with someone new to royal life. Palace veterans who had served multiple members of the royal family reportedly tried to ease the transition. They understood that Meghan was entering an unfamiliar world with arcane rules and unspoken expectations. Their attempts to provide guidance, however, were allegedly interpreted as obstruction or condescension. One source claimed that practical advice about royal protocols was dismissed with the attitude that her way was better, regardless of decades of institutional knowledge suggesting otherwise. The irony is staggering. Here were people trying to help her succeed, and their efforts allegedly only created more friction. The email situation deserves particular attention because it represents a documented example rather than secondhand recollection. 5 a.m. messages were reportedly not occasional occurrences, but rather a pattern, and the content allegedly went beyond simple work requests. Sources described communications that were demanding, curt, and left recipients anxious about their job security if responses were not immediate. One insider described checking their phone obsessively through the night, unable to sleep properly, because the consequences of missing an early morning message allegedly felt catastrophic. What makes these allegations particularly troubling is their consistency. This was not one difficult period or one personality clash. According to sources, the pattern repeated with multiple staff members across different roles. Personal assistants, communication staff, and household managers all allegedly experienced similar treatment despite having no previous connection to one another. When the same complaints emerge from unrelated parties across different time periods, coincidence becomes an increasingly difficult explanation to sustain. But this was before the wedding, and what came after was allegedly far more intense, with the staff departure rate reaching levels the royal household had never seen. The numbers tell a story that no amount of public relations spin can effectively counter. Within the first 2 years of Meghan's integration into the royal family, an unprecedented number of staff members departed the Sussex household. We are not talking about 1 or 2 people moving on to new opportunities, which would be entirely normal in any workplace. We are talking about a mass exodus that had palace HR scrambling to understand what was happening. Sources suggest that at least 8 senior staff members left during this period, some departing so quickly their positions remained vacant for months. Among the most notable departures was Samantha Cohen, a veteran palace aide who had served the Queen herself. Cohen initially stayed on to help Harry and Meghan transition into married life and their new roles, a position that should have been a career highlight. Instead, she reportedly left earlier than planned, with sources claiming her experience was far more challenging than anticipated. When someone who has successfully navigated decades of palace politics, including some of the most turbulent periods in recent royal history, chooses to exit early from a position, that speaks volumes about what they allegedly encountered. Personal assistants came and went with alarming frequency. One assistant reportedly lasted only a few months before departing, followed by another whose tenure was similarly brief. Communication staff faced constant turnover. The pattern was so pronounced that recruitment became increasingly difficult. Word spreads quickly in professional circles, and sources claim that the Sussex household developed a reputation that made qualified candidates hesitant to apply. Let us be brutally honest here. When your workplace reputation precedes you to the point where people turn down prestigious positions, something has gone seriously wrong. Perhaps the most damning detail involves staff members who allegedly left without securing alternative employment. In any normal circumstance, particularly during economically uncertain uncertain times, professionals cling to paying positions until they have something else lined up. Job security matters. Yet sources claim that multiple individuals preferred the financial uncertainty of unemployment to continued service in the Sussex household. One insider described it as escape rather than resignation. People were not leaving for better opportunities. They were allegedly leaving to escape an allegedly intolerable situation. Compare this to other royal households, and the contrast becomes stark. The Princess of Wales, for instance, has maintained remarkable staff loyalty over the years. Some of her team members have been with her for over a decade. Prince William's household shows similar stability. Even the late Queen Elizabeth, who by all accounts could be demanding in her expectations, retained staff for entire careers. The Sussex situation represented an anomaly so extreme that it demanded explanation. The palace tried to contain the damage, spinning departures as natural transitions and declining to comment on internal personnel matters. But the volume of departures made silence increasingly untenable. Reporters began connecting dots, and the phrase Sussex Survivors Club entered the public lexicon. And still, Meghan's defenders insisted the departures were coincidental, that staff members were simply overwhelmed by media pressure, that institutional racism was pushing people away. The palace tried to contain the damage, but one confrontation allegedly crossed every line, and it happened before Meghan even walked down the aisle. The Tiara Incident has become legendary in royal watching circles, and what allegedly transpired reveals a fundamental clash between expectation and reality. According to multiple sources, Meghan had her heart set on a specific tiara for her wedding day, reportedly the emerald Kokoshnik tiara that once belonged to Princess Margaret. The Queen, however, had other plans. Her Majesty allegedly offered a different piece, the stunning Queen Mary diamond bandeau that Meghan ultimately wore. What should have been a gracious acceptance of a generous gift from the monarch allegedly became a confrontation. Sources claim that when Meghan was told she could not have the tiara she wanted, the response was not understanding acceptance of the Queen's prerogative. Instead, there was allegedly pushback, complaints, and an atmosphere of tension that made palace staff deeply uncomfortable. Enter Prince Harry, whose response to the situation allegedly set a tone that would define the Sussex dynamic going forward. According to insiders, Harry reportedly declared that what Meghan wants, Meghan gets. 6 words that sources claim became an unofficial motto within the household, and not in a flattering sense. Let me be clear about the context here. The Queen of England was offering a piece from the royal collection for Meghan's wedding day. This was not some inferior consolation prize. This was a magnificent tiara with genuine historical significance, a gesture of welcome into the family. The alleged demand for a different piece, one with potentially complicated provenance and accessibility issues, reportedly struck palace veterans as breathtakingly presumptuous. One insider described it as not understanding the privilege being offered because something else was wanted. And folks, that framing tells you everything about the alleged mindset at play. The wedding preparations allegedly extended this pattern beyond the tiara. Dressmakers and craftspeople working on the trousseau reportedly experienced similar difficulties. These are artisans at the absolute peak of their profession, people who have dressed royalty and celebrities with impeccable results. Yet sources claim that working with Meghan was uniquely challenging, with exacting demands and criticism that felt disproportionate to minor imperfections. One source close to the situation described the atmosphere as nothing ever being quite right, no effort ever fully appreciated. Then there is the bridesmaid dress fitting, an incident that reportedly caused friction between Meghan and Catherine, the then Duchess of Cambridge. According to multiple sources, the fitting for Princess Charlotte's dress did not go smoothly. Whether Meghan made Catherine cry, as some sources claim, or Catherine made Meghan cry, as Meghan later insisted to Oprah, remains disputed. What is not disputed is that something went wrong significant enough to require follow-up conversations and alleged apologies. The fact that this incident became public knowledge at all suggests the severity of what occurred. Yet the palace kept quiet, bound by tradition and desperate to avoid public scandal during what should have been a celebratory period. That silence allowed the narrative to be shaped by whoever spoke first, and Meghan would eventually choose to speak very loudly indeed, until someone finally documented everything, creating a paper trail that would become impossible to ignore. Behind the palace's public silence, something significant was allegedly happening in the HR department. According to multiple reports, a formal complaint file was being compiled, gathering testimonies from multiple staff members about their experiences working for the Duchess of Sussex. This was not palace gossip being written down. This was allegedly an official documentation process following proper workplace protocols. The existence of this file, which Buckingham Palace has never officially confirmed or denied, suggests that the concerns were serious enough to warrant formal institutional response. Jason Knauf's email has become perhaps the most concrete piece of evidence in this entire saga. Knauf, who served as communications secretary to the Sussexes, allegedly sent an email documenting concerns about Meghan's treatment of staff in real time. This was not a retrospective complaint colored by hindsight or grievance. This was contemporary documentation of what was allegedly occurring. created while events were unfolding. The email reportedly detailed specific incidents and expressed concern that staff members were being bullied and that nothing was being done to address the situation. The significance of the Knauf email cannot be overstated. Here was a senior staff member, someone in Meghan's inner professional circle, essentially creating a formal record of alleged misconduct. In any normal workplace, such documentation would trigger immediate investigation and potential consequences. In the palace, bound by its culture of discretion and protection, the response was allegedly more muted. Sources claim that senior royals were briefed on the concerns but chose to handle the matter internally rather than through formal channels. And here is where the institutional failure becomes apparent. By treating serious workplace allegations as a family matter rather than an HR matter, the palace allegedly allowed the situation to continue. Staff members who might have expected protection found themselves navigating an environment where speaking up felt pointless or even dangerous to their careers. One source described feeling abandoned by the very institution they had devoted their professional lives to serving. Let that sink in. Loyal employees allegedly left to fend for themselves while the palace prioritized image management over workplace welfare. The historical contrast is instructive. When other members of the royal family faced allegations of misconduct, the palace response varied based on the severity and public visibility of the claims. Yet in this case, despite allegedly documented evidence from multiple sources, the approach was reportedly containment rather than confrontation. Some observers have suggested this was an attempt to give Harry and Meghan the benefit of the doubt, allowing them time to adjust to royal life. Others argue it was simply institutional paralysis in the face of an unprecedented situation. The file reportedly contained not just Knauf's email but testimonies from multiple former staff members, each allegedly describing similar patterns of behavior. When multiple independent witnesses describe consistent experiences, the credibility of the collective account strengthens considerably. Yet the palace's determination to handle matters quietly meant this evidence remained hidden from public view. But Meghan's defenders say this evidence tells a completely different story, and their counter-narrative demands fair examination. Meghan Markle has never accepted the characterization of herself as a difficult boss or a bully. In her telling, she was the victim of an institution that never wanted her to succeed, a target of racism both subtle and overt, and a woman held to impossible standards that her white counterparts never faced. This narrative, articulated most powerfully during her March 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey, presents an entirely different interpretation of the same events. And in fairness, her perspective deserves examination. According to Meghan, she received virtually no support from palace infrastructure, despite being subjected to unprecedented media hostility. She described reaching out for help with her mental health struggles and being denied access to treatment. She painted a picture of an institution that was at best indifferent to her suffering and at worst actively complicit in her persecution. In this telling, complaints about her behavior were not legitimate workplace concerns, but rather manifestations of institutional resistance to a black woman in their midst. Sources close to Meghan have offered their own characterization of her management style. Rather than demanding or difficult, they describe her as someone who demands excellence but not in unreasonable ways. The 5 a.m. emails, they suggest, reflected her own work ethic rather than expectations that others maintain the same hours. The high standards, they argue, were no different from what any ambitious professional might expect from their team. The turnover in this framing resulted from the extraordinary pressures of the role rather than any failing on Meghan's part. The cultural clash theory has gained traction among her defenders. American workplace culture, they argue, operates differently from British norms. Directness that might seem refreshingly honest in Los Angeles could read as rudeness in the more indirect British professional environment. The hierarchical deference expected in palace settings might strike an American as unnecessarily submissive. In this interpretation, Meghan was not doing anything wrong but rather operating according to cultural norms that clashed with an environment unprepared for her approach. Allow me to translate. She was not the problem. The institution was the problem. There is also the question of racial dynamics that cannot be ignored. Meghan was the first biracial person to marry into the senior British royal family in modern history. The scrutiny she faced was demonstrably different from what white royal spouses experienced. Some of the media coverage was genuinely racist, and critics who deny this entirely are not engaging honestly with the evidence. The question is whether legitimate concerns about racism should automatically invalidate legitimate concerns about workplace behavior. These are not mutually exclusive possibilities. The problem with Meghan's counter-narrative, however, is its absolutism. In her telling, she bears no responsibility for any of the difficulties she encountered. Every complaint is reframed as an attack. Every criticism is prejudice. The consistency of allegations across multiple unrelated individuals, spanning different roles and time periods, is never meaningfully addressed. When 18 former staff members describe similar experiences, dismissing them all as racist or jealous strains credibility. Then came the investigation that was supposed to settle everything, and what happened to its findings is perhaps the most telling detail of all. In March 2021, Buckingham Palace announced it would investigate the bullying allegations against Meghan Markle. This was an unusual step for an institution that typically prefers to handle such matters with absolute discretion. The announcement came just days before the explosive Oprah interview aired, timing that suggested the palace was preparing its own response to allegations it knew were coming. But what happened to this investigation reveals more about institutional priorities than any public statement could. The investigation was reportedly conducted by an independent law firm, with current and former staff members invited to share their experiences. Sources suggested the process was thorough, involving multiple interviews and examination of documented evidence. The scope allegedly extended beyond individual incidents to examine patterns of behavior over time. This was not a cursory check designed to quickly exonerate anyone. This was by all accounts a serious inquiry into serious allegations. Then silence. Complete and total silence. The investigation concluded, reportedly in the summer of 2022, and its findings were never released. Buckingham Palace announced only that recommendations for HR policy improvements had been implemented, offering no details about what those recommendations were or what they were responding to. The public, which had been promised accountability, received nothing resembling answers. Let that sink in. An official investigation into alleged bullying was completed, and the institution simply refused to share what it found. The decision to bury the findings raises uncomfortable questions. If the investigation had cleared Meghan of all allegations, surely that would be worth publicizing. Her reputation would be restored, her accusers discredited, and the matter closed definitively. The fact that the palace chose silence instead has led many observers to draw their own conclusions. One source put it bluntly: "You do not hide exonerations. You hide findings that would create more problems than they solve." Meghan's team demanded transparency on other matters. They insisted that conversations about Archie's potential skin color be publicly addressed. They demanded corrections to news stories they considered inaccurate. They wanted the palace to be more forthcoming about its internal workings. Yet when transparency about the bullying investigation would have served Meghan's interests, had she been cleared, the demands for openness mysteriously ceased. The inconsistency is impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, staff members who had participated in the investigation reportedly felt betrayed. They had shared painful experiences with investigators, trusting that their testimonies would lead to some form of accountability or at least acknowledgement. Instead, their voices were again silenced, this time by institutional decision rather than cultural tradition. One source described it as being used and discarded, their experiences treated as inconvenient rather than important. The silence only made the whisper network grow louder, and what was happening in Montecito suggested the pattern had not ended with their departure from royal life. The Sussex departure from royal duties was supposed to represent a fresh start, an opportunity to build something new away from the allegedly stifling constraints of palace life. Archewell, their non-profit foundation, was announced with characteristic fanfare. Podcast deals, Netflix agreements, and speaking engagements promised a new chapter defined by financial independence and creative freedom. Meghan would finally be able to operate on her own terms, without palace protocols or institutional interference. And then the staff departures began. The numbers from Archewell are remarkable and not in a flattering way. By conservative counts, at least 18 staff members have departed since the organization's founding. Some of these were amicable transitions announced with warm press releases. Many others were not. The turnover rate at this relatively small operation far exceeds industry norms for comparable organizations. When your foundation cannot retain employees despite offering salaries, Montecito proximity, and association with global celebrities, something significant is happening. The parallels to the palace experience are impossible to ignore. Former Archewell employees have reportedly described similar patterns to those alleged by palace staff. The demanding messages, the high expectations, the difficulty in meeting standards that allegedly kept shifting. Sources close to the situation describe an organization where staff members learned to dread interactions with Meghan specifically, while finding Harry more approachable and reasonable. One insider allegedly observed that the pattern did not change with the location, only the scenery changed. The Gayle King interview provided a fascinating window into Sussex dynamics. During what was supposed to be Meghan's moment to promote her lifestyle venture, Harry interrupted repeatedly, seemingly redirecting conversations and managing messaging in real time. Royal watchers noted the tension visible in Meghan's face during some of these interruptions. Whether this represented genuine friction or simply clumsy media management remains unclear, but it suggested behind-the-scenes dynamics that diverge from the partnership image they typically project. The consequences for Meghan's professional ambitions are becoming increasingly apparent. Hollywood operates on relationships and reputation. Producers, executives, and collaborators talk to each other. Word spreads about which talents are easy to work with and which are challenging. Sources in the entertainment industry have suggested that Meghan's reputation as a difficult collaborator has preceded her into meetings, making some potential partners hesitant. Her podcast was canceled after one season despite reportedly costing Spotify millions. Her Netflix output has been limited and generally panned by critics. The business ventures tell their own story. American Riviera Orchard, her lifestyle brand launched with considerable anticipation, has struggled to gain traction. Products were sent to influencers who posted enthusiastically, then the momentum seemed to stall. The promised jams and home goods have not materialized in stores. For someone with Meghan's profile and resources, the relatively modest commercial impact suggests obstacles beyond mere bad luck, and now, the question everyone is asking has become impossible to avoid. Is this coincidence, or is it character revealed through pattern? When we step back and examine the totality of evidence, a coherent picture emerges that demands honest assessment. We have documented allegations from the palace period, including Jason Knauf's contemporaneous email. We have an unprecedented staff turnover rate during the Sussex royal household years. We have an official investigation whose findings were buried. We have ongoing turnover at Archewell that mirrors the patterns from their royal days. We have former employees from both periods describing remarkably similar experiences. And we have a subject who categorically denies any responsibility while dismissing all critics as racist, jealous, or institutionally motivated. The contrast with Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has become a recurring reference point in these discussions, and for good reason. Catherine's staff members have demonstrated remarkable loyalty over more than a decade of service. Some have followed her from Kensington Palace through multiple moves and role changes. When staff members choose to stay for years rather than months, when they speak warmly of their employer in private as well as public, that reveals something meaningful about workplace culture. The two scenarios could not be more different. Meghan has built her entire public brand on compassion, empowerment, and kindness. Her speeches invoke these values constantly. Her charitable work centers on these principles. Her lifestyle brand promises warmth and authenticity. Yet the testimony of those who have worked most closely with her professionally paints a portrait dramatically at odds with this image. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Either multiple independent witnesses across different continents and different years are coordinating an elaborate deception, or the public persona diverges significantly from private reality. The question of whether so many people could really be lying deserves serious consideration. We are not talking about one disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. We are talking about numerous individuals who had no prior connection to each other, who worked in different roles during different periods, and who described fundamentally similar experiences. The statistical probability of this being coordinated fabrication is vanishingly small. Human beings simply do not synchronize invented grievances with this level of consistency, unless they are actually describing real experiences. And yet the alternative interpretation also deserves acknowledgement. Perhaps Meghan is simply a demanding professional operating in environments unprepared for her intensity. Perhaps the standards she sets are high but not unreasonable. Perhaps she has been unfairly held to standards that male executives of similar demeanor would never face. Perhaps the pattern reflects the difficulty of her position rather than any failing in her character. These possibilities cannot be dismissed entirely without engaging in the same absolutism her defenders employ. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the complicated middle. A woman with genuinely progressive values and genuine blind spots. A boss who believes in empowerment but perhaps struggles to practice it consistently. A public figure whose carefully cultivated image has created impossible expectations for her actual human behavior. The reality is messier than either the condemnation or the defense allows. But here is what cannot be denied. When 18 or more former staff members describe similar experiences across multiple settings and multiple years, when an official investigation's findings are buried rather than released, when turnover rates far exceed any reasonable baseline, something meaningful is being communicated. Dismissing it all as conspiracy or racism is not honest engagement with the evidence. Neither is gleeful pile-on without acknowledging the complexities. The truth may never fully emerge from behind the carefully managed statements and strategic leaks. What we have instead is a pattern that demands acknowledgement even as its interpretation remains contested. And that pattern continues to raise uncomfortable questions about the distance between who Meghan presents herself to be and who she allegedly is behind closed doors. Drop your thoughts below, like, subscribe, and stay tuned. The next video is waiting and you will not believe what is coming next.